Hello and welcome to another episode of React Roundup. I'll be your host today, Nader Dabbit. Today on our panel, we have Lucas Heisch.
Hello, everybody.
David Sedia.
Hey, everybody.
And Thomas Aylott.
Hello, Internet people.
Hey, folks, I just want to let you know quickly about Netlify. Netlify is a really cool system for hosting what are traditionally known as static sites. However, the real benefit that I've been finding is that I don't have to mess with a back end. I can just set things up. I build the website out. I've been using a system called 11DJS, and you just deploy it. And then anything that you have that you want to do, you can do on the front end. So if you want to pull in some kind of database with Firebase or something else, if you want to collect form data, Netlify provides all kinds of services that make it easy to do all that stuff. If you're trying to do serverless, they have a really, really neat serverless setup that will allow you to deploy your websites without having to deploy a backend, and it'll do some of the work for you. I just love it. So if you're looking for a way that you can actually deploy a website that only has front-end technology in it, gives you all the tools that you typically need for the back end without having to actually program the back end, then give them a try. Go check them out at netlify.com.
So today our special guests are us. We're going to be having a discussion with us as the panelists, but I think we have a pretty interesting topic that we're going to be going over today. Depending on how we frame the topic, it may or may not sound interesting to you, but we were talking about maybe full stack development with React, but also we had another name for it, maybe like what should we delegate to the back end? What are some other ways that we might be able to frame this?
I guess, if you're from the perspective of somebody on the back end, what do you delegate to the front end?
Right, okay. So kind of like data concerns and dynamic data concerns and things like that, I guess. So I guess I'll kick off, I can kind of kick off the conversation. I know that as a React developer, there's a lot of talk about dealing with state. The state is usually the form of some data. It could be also some UI state, but for the purposes of this conversation, let's think about like data. So where does the data fetching, I guess, start coming into play typically in your experience and, in a typical React app, and like what's the way that you kind of like handle that? I know when an application loads, typically there's some type of initialization process. You might have some functions that go and start fetching data from your API and things like that. So Thomas, do you want to kind of start off how you think about creating all of this stuff when you're building a new app?
Yeah, so the big difference, the major shift, because there was the old school web that started in like the 90s, and then there was Web 2.0, which wasn't very different. But Web 2.0 is like as soon as you load the page, it's like it does all the data fetching on the back end, serves you like static HTML and CSS with maybe just a little bit of like jQuery or whatever to make the forms a little bit fancy. But kind of the major shift from Web 2.0 to, the modern web apps is making a separation between the app experience itself and the data fetching. So in modern apps, you expect the experience to load the app instantaneously, to be able to see kind of the basic UI of the app, and then to see the, data fetching or whatever. Ideally, and it would show you some data immediately, but the user experience expectation has shifted now. People don't want to wait, looking at blank screens while the entire app loads. They want to stare at an app while data loads.
Yeah, it makes sense. I would add that we actually added that type of application to the web. We still have like the old school.
Yeah.
So for instance, like a lot of times we have pages that have like SEO concerns, right? We need to. It's more like a page than an application, right? We still expect performance to be good enough in a way that it's difficult to get without some server-side rendering, right? So you have like the data fetching in the server, you generate your HTML and send it to the user. But the thing that is interesting in the React world is that the two types of data fetching, they're almost like the same, right? When you server-side render your React application, you're actually like fetching the data in an initial state that ideally would also work if you just send the React app without server-side rendering to the client, right? So it's like almost like a decision we make. Of course, in the real world, it's not that simple, but conceptually, it's very similar.
Yeah. So I guess the big difference is that we've decoupled the user experience from the technology to be, you're not locked in because of your tech choice.
Yeah. So when you work, like in your experience, when you work with front-end applications, are you, since like this interplay between front-end and back-end is strong, like how much do you touch the back-end? Like how actively do you work on the back-end parts that are serving data to your front-end application?
I guess it kind of depends how your team is structured and whether or not you consider yourself a full stack developer, or whether your application that you're working on puts you in that position. I would say for the most part, like the larger the team, the less that you'll be touching the back end as a front end developer, and the smaller the team, the more you'll be, touching the back end. That's a generalization, of course, but that kind of seems to be what I've seen in my experience. And for people that are dealing with the more complex front ends, we're really typically not really working with the back ends because we have so much work to do on the front end and we're so specialized. And a lot of times when you get into the point in your career where you are very, very good at what you do and you're specialized, they want you to be working on one thing and one thing that you're good at. And that's typically, building out these complex single page applications. What's interesting to me, though, and especially for me, because now I'm working at AWS and I'm working with a lot of serverless technologies, is we're seeing some of these serverless technologies kind of positioned as easy ways for front-end developers to start building full-stack apps, because a lot of the back-end complexity is abstracted away, and you're also writing JavaScript, and you're working with APIs, and you're not actually dealing with a lot of the infrastructure and things that a lot of back-end developers and DevOps people, used to have to deal with.
Yeah, it's partly the problem of, if all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So if you identify yourself as a server-side person, then you're naturally going to want to have a server.
I was going to say, is the hammer JavaScript in this example?
That too.
I think it's interesting because it seems like this move towards JavaScript everywhere makes it easier to move between front end and back end too. Whereas, maybe in the past you had to juggle between, now I'm writing Ruby, now I'm writing JavaScript, and now you can sort of, depending on your stack, of course, not like everyone's on JavaScript, but sometimes it's easier.
Yeah, it's super interesting to see the emergence and the growth of JavaScript. Like everyone has, there's so many things that people have that are wrong with the language, but we see it just continue to explode. It's kind of crazy, that so many things are now like first-class JavaScript.
It works. Yeah, it works. It works well enough for most applications. So it's just like conquering everything.
It also makes really good business sense because then you don't have to be expert at hiring all these people from different kind of camps and tribes and having to make them all work well together. You can kind of, get off the shelf JavaScript person and just throw them on different teams and hope it works great.
Yeah, because even though the language is JavaScript, the platforms are different, and you usually need a lot of platform related knowledge. It's the same with like React and React Native, right? You think that you're just gonna, I do a lot of React. Let me do some React Native now. It's gonna be so easy, and it's like, oh my god.
Well,
yeah. It's like the same thing with like Node and like browser JavaScript. Right. Yeah, there is always like one thing and another. So you were talking about separating the front end and the back end in different companies. I worked in two companies that were almost like in an opposing way. So today I work in a full stack kind of teams. So we have in each team people they're dealing with from the database layer to the CSS in the same team. So it's what they call like feature teams, right? So one team is, if I'm doing a feature, we should be able to develop the whole like vertical of the feature inside the team. So the teams are more like business theme related. And I've worked in a company that like I was in the front end team of a particular product. So we didn't touch like any server side code. And today I see like pros and cons with both. Like I thought the feature teams were like better, always better, but I see some things that were really good when separating. So a couple of pros and cons. Like for feature teams, it's really good to have independence in terms of business. Like if business want to implement one feature, they go to one team. Like I remember that like we would like talk with the backend teams about a feature, and then like some issues in their sprint, and they would create this back-end changes, and then the next sprint we would work on it on the front end. And a lot of times like they needed to do some work, and it would go back to their next sprint. So things would take a long time because we were always like trying to fit work in the different sprints for back-end and front end. So this is like a really big con. On the other hand, when you have like a back-end team that their deliverable is like an API, I think that the APIs were so much cleaner between the different teams. So like it was so easy to just create like a new front end that would consume those APIs. I feel that like in a feature team, when you own the full stack, a lot of times you end up like, okay, this API can have like this weird interface because like I am the one creating the clients in the front end. So like I can deal with this weird part of the API because I'm the one going to consume the API anyway. So like I can deal with the weird part on both. So I think that feature teams end up with like weirder interfaces than when teams are well separated.
Yeah. I think I've had the same experience. I worked at a company that had feature teams like that, and so in our case, it was Java on the back end, like Spring MVC, and then just like jQuery type stuff in the front end. Mm-hmm. And it was, juggling between the two, I felt like you needed to be pretty good at two different skill sets, I think. You've got the front end side where you're doing everything visually, and then the back end where you're doing data modeling and SQL queries and trying to like tune your SQL queries and stuff. It's very different skill sets that don't often overlap. And I think it's tough to be good at all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think the other problem, like you were saying, Lucas, where you have a feature in mind, and so you're sort of thinking of it as, I need to build this feature. So how do I get the data, and how do I display that data? And you munge it all together in your head, and it's like, I need the data to look like this, and I'll just make the back end do that for me. Where it's and you end up making kind of like an API that maybe not as reusable.
Yeah, one good outcome of having like separated front end and back end teams was that like in our hackathons, it was like there were like a yearly hackathon that people were like creating products for the company. The APIs had like such a good and generic interfaces that people were just like creating front end applications that were ready to be used in production in after 3 days. Like they were like interfacing, not ready to be used in production, but like you would not need a lot of work to make them production ready, because you were already like accessing APIs, production APIs in the hackathon, because the production APIs had like interfaces that were like ready for the world. They didn't have like any particular thing for that particular team.
You can kind of go overboard in that direction too. Like if you have really separated, like if there's like a front end engineering team and there's like a back end engineering team, they're both building APIs that like completely separate product teams are using. Mm-hmm. The danger there is that those APIs might be completely disconnected from reality of what actually needs to be in reality. So they're building all these APIs guessing what product teams might need, and then they end up like top down dictating like, this is how you're going to build your app, and really painting you into a corner. But when you have feature teams, when you have product teams that they're focused on like delivering value to real people in the real world. But then if you have, it's all feature teams and you don't have anybody focused on and incentivized and gold on having clean APIs.
Perfect.
And it becomes trash so fast.
So this is a trade-off. The way we try to navigate in here at my work today on that part is that like front-end people we have like a heavier hand on deciding on the interface. So in our case, we use GraphQL. We have like a heavier hand on decide the interface, and it's almost like the GraphQL is owned by us in the front end, and then we interface with like the different services of the back end. And it's interesting that you mentioned the AWS products, the serverless products, Nader, that you're working with, because it's similar to that thing. It's like you can define your interface, right? And then you are creating those data sources according to the interface that was defined by the front end. I think it's like an interesting like sweet spot, maybe.
Yeah, I think that like sort of like thinking in terms of separation of concerns, like each side separates concerns differently, maybe, right? And like the front end and the back end think about things differently. So the best way to organize your data or your database might not be the best way to organize your data for the front end.
Oh, 100%. And
right? And so there's some massaging to do there. And where do you do it?
It might be not the best way to send messages over the wire to, like.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, we have some legacy enums, C# enums here until today. Like that should definitely be like strings.
So do you think this conversation kind of leads us to the discussion of REST versus GraphQL? Because when you think about it, we're just accessing REST endpoints, or that's what we've typically done in the past. Mm-hmm. And we don't really have a lot of control over, what comes back. If we overfetch, we end up taking the data, cleaning it up on the client and then serving whatever we'd like to use. Or if we underfetch, we end up making multiple API calls.
Yeah.
And I feel like, that seems to be where GraphQL shines and is starting to become, more and more popular, really.
Yeah.
Because really the problem space that is the purview of the front-end engineering team is the user experience, implementing the best possible user experience. And, what technologies you use, anything that could possibly affect user experience has to be owned by the people who own that problem space. And, REST versus GraphQL is absolutely in the purview of that situation. Because if you're overfetching, underfetching, that has a serious implications, especially if you have, the possibility of like going to like 2G networks, depending on, where people are, mobile first, all this stuff. So GraphQL is totally a front-end engineering oriented thing. I mean, you can still, implement that on the client in the short term and that it's actually using REST APIs, but you really need to make intentional choices with, what is affecting real people in the real world and affecting the metrics that you care about.
Yeah, the GraphQL versus REST thing is maybe even a large thing. Is like a middleware. Like, are middlewares a good solution for this problem? And GraphQL is just like a good protocol for this middleware, right? And the fact that it's that it's a good standard, you can have like good tooling around it. You can create middlewares that generate backends for you, like the app sync stuff. But I think that the issue of the middlewares is interesting, and underfetching is probably like 99% of the problems that I had. It's like no REST API that my application touched solved my problem 100%. I always needed to get data from more than one API, and usually using the response from the previous one. So
right.
I would have all that transaction issue that like, okay, so we're going like over the wire with all these network requests that some should be parallel, some should be. That was like a nightmare. So like in the e-commerce world that I was working, like when I show a cart of products in the page, I should show customer data, should show cart data, I should show product data, and these APIs should not talk among themselves. That's the thing that I was like, okay, so if they do not talk among themselves, like I need to do all the heavy work. I know that this keeps them generic. So what I think about REST today is not that REST is bad or GraphQL or other middlewares are good. I just think that REST is usually too low level for front-end direct consumption. It's not that it's wrong. Actually REST is really good, and I like the contracts that it has. Like I like to think about like HTTP verbs and things like that. I just think it's too low level. It's just like trying to create like a web page with C++. I don't know. It's like
I guess it boils down to encapsulation. You know, where are you encapsulating this stuff? Are you spreading the complexity out all over the front end? Are you encapsulating all of the data fetching into one unit, wherever it lives, however it's implemented? Is it a single thing, or is it just kind of spread out everywhere?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Depends on your resources, maybe too. It's like if you have really independent resources that don't need to, you don't need to display products with users or whatever. Like if you can get away with just displaying the products, then REST is great for that. Just get the list of products and display it. But yeah, if you start to need to like annotate things with all this metadata or whatever, then
that's it.
Yeah, it gets messy.
So the front end is the one needed to do all the data stitching work.
Yeah.
So that's why they started at, I remember, like, I love the name. It's like BFFs, which are like backend for front end. So people started, people started like talking about, okay, so let's make a middleware that does all the orchestration, and the front end just do like one request to this middleware. We're putting all the orchestrating and transforming logic in this middleware and serves it to the front end. So we're separating the two concerns. Yeah. We're decoupling the front end from the APIs. So if tomorrow I change like the product API to a new product API, or like I create an image API that will serve the image that the product does not need to serve the image, it's transparent to the front end. It's like only this middleware needed to handle it. And then GraphQL came as a second like step. It's like, okay, so there is a really cool like generic way of dealing with this problem. So let's all adhere to this protocol, which I think works really well for 98% of the times.
Yeah, one major concern is when you have the possibility of having decoupled versioning, like if you're doing like a native mobile app, and if there's a possibility that people are running different versions of the same client talking to the very latest version of the back end, like how do you make sure that the app that you shipped a year and a half ago, that the server still responds with the data that version of the app can handle, and how do you test that? And how do you have certainty that you're not going to break the world?
In REST world or in the GraphQL world?
Just in general. That was kind of like one of the core problems that GraphQL was created to solve.
Yeah. Actually, to be honest with you, I think this problem is kind of solved in the REST world and not like well solved in the GraphQL. Like I think that this is like a API versioning problem, and with REST APIs, you just create a new endpoint with a new version, so you don't need to kill the older versions with REST endpoints. GraphQL, we are almost always like changing the schema, so it's a matter of like we deprecate some fields, but we cannot remove them because we don't know who is using. So
right. You deprecate from what I understand, as far as best practices are concerned, you deprecate fields, then you're able to run analytics and see when fields are no longer being used, and then you can
That's it.
Those.
Exactly.
If I understand properly, and you used to work at Facebook, but this was probably before GraphQL was big there. They don't ever even version their GraphQL API. They've been using the same schema since the very beginning. And they
have to release a new version every few minutes because the schema is constantly changing.
Right. So they're just consistently evolving their schema, and they haven't ever like deprecated an entire version. They just kind of like continue evolving their schema.
So they're just like adding fields and so it's like a gigantic schema today.
Yep.
That's what I understand. Yeah, we actually had someone from Facebook on the GraphQL Patterns podcast, and that's what I understood. Yeah, It was really interesting to kind of hear that.
Yeah, that seems to me like an interesting pattern. Like deprecate it, put some metrics on it, and if there's still applications hitting it, if you really need to remove that field, go find it. But it's still weird, right? Because like, how long do you need to observe it? Yeah, on Facebook scale,
it's
probably
a tricky problem.
Yeah,
everything about GraphQL is just so different than what I've ever been used to.
yeah, because in the REST world, it's just like an npm package. You like version it. As soon as you have like a breaking change, if you're not adding something, if you're removing, you just create a new version. So like v3, like cart v3, you make cart v2 not you let it work the way it was working before, and you create like a new API, a new endpoint. There's a new URL. So if you're still hitting the old URL, you get the old response. If you're hitting the new URL, you're getting the new response. So it's just like changing to a new library, right?
I think it partly depends on how you structure your company.
Yeah, I guess another solution is to do what my like Capital One mobile app does, and every month or two, it's like you have to install a new version now, and it's just like, you can't use it anymore. Go update.
Yeah. Facebook doesn't have that option. One tricky issue is like there are people in the world that literally cannot update their apps without physically buying new hardware because there's just not enough space on the device to download the new version. And the existing version is baked into the firmware. So there's no way to delete the current version to free up space, and there's no way to install the new. So you're just stuck. So you have to support that version for the life of the hardware.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give you full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open source Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at Sentry.io.
Even though I'm not working with Clojure today, I worked with Clojure before. One thing I really like about Clojure is that if you listen to the talks of the people developing Clojure and Clojure script, they seem to be like among the group of the smartest people thinking about stuff. Yeah, I just love like Rich Hickey and all those talks and stuff like that. And I heard that they are going towards a never delete anything. Like there's no reason to have a breaking change.
Interesting.
Their database is the Datomic database, which is an append-only database. That it's a database that does not you cannot edit anything or you cannot delete anything. You're just like changing things is like adding new events and like, so that means that you have everything. You have the whole history, so you can query anything at any point in time by design.
Oh, awesome!
This is a very hard problem to solve. And they solved like in the database layer with Datomic, so it seems that it's the best like implementation of that. And they were saying now we're thinking about that even with like code, they say like if you create a breaking change of a library of a function in a library, they say like, why throwing away the previous function? Let people just use it and provide a new one, like create a new one. So they name space the functions in the libraries with like the version. So if you're using like the v1 namespace, it's like okay, like it's gonna be there. Like I don't want to break anything. Like some systems are just running. Why should we break stuff? So they're going towards like immutability, also as an engineering practice. There was like Clojure used immutability by default in their variables, and they say like, and it brought us so much benefits in terms of architecture. Even like it spilled back to the front end world. It influenced React a lot and Redux, right? All these patterns of like immutability. we know that it leads to like healthier engineering practices. And they were saying like, why not? Like now we brought it to the database and say like, so now we're starting to bring it to functionality. Like why delete old functions? Why not let them be and create new ones? So this is an interesting thing to think about. It's like the breaking change only breaks stuff because you chose to break stuff. Why not create a new one? And people start using the new one. Do not delete the old one.
Yeah, that smells kind of like the GraphQL way. Is like like this field exists forever. It's like maybe have a deprecation flag so it doesn't show up in autocomplete or whatever.
Yeah, just so people starting to use it now, like know that there's a newer, a better way of doing it. So the deprecation returns like, okay, so this is deprecated, should not use it. But like, why break it? Like, why something that is working today should not be working tomorrow?
That's kind of like the React philosophy as far as like upgrades go. So they support, like mix-ins, I think, even still work. It's like you probably shouldn't be using mix-ins, but if you need to, go.
JavaScript. If you think about like the web APIs, we still have like sub str, even though now we have substring. So you could say that maybe this is one of the reasons of success. Like I remember people were talking about Windows that way too. Windows, since it's a very like enterprise operational system, like in the 1900s, people said that you could, in Windows, 2000, you could run things from your Windows 3.0. That was like
a video one time where somebody I think it was like Photoshop. They installed like Photoshop 1 and then they just installed every single like update to Photoshop. And it all just worked.
Yeah, this is like, that created a lot of garbage in whatever you were using. Like if you think about all those crazy JavaScript, like document.cookie, right? That thing is like from, I don't know, how, like adding a cookie, reading a cookie is so cumbersome, but it's like this, like I'm not going to break the past. So maybe that's an interesting concept, like immutability.
Interesting idea. I think it's like syscalls are sort of like this too, right? Like the low-level Unix-y syscalls. I think there's a few functions that have multiple versions, and you'll have like I'm trying to find examples, but first one that comes up is accept or maybe open. I don't know. Accept has like an accept and an accept for, and they do different things, but they didn't change the old one because you've got years and years of code running on it. So
just give a new one. Yeah.
It's like when teaching somebody something, it's like you don't want to just run in and attack their current beliefs. You teach them the new stuff. They start to rely on that. It's like having two crutches. They've been leaning on this one, their existing knowledge, their existing experiences and tools. It works for them. They've been using it for this long. They're going to hold on to it tightly. You try to kick it out from under them. So instead you give them, here's the new thing. And then once they get comfortable leaning on that, they'll throw away the old crap themselves.
Yeah. I'm thinking about that now when developing components that are going to be shared throughout the company. So usually, we have this like centralized component SDK style project, right? That has some components that should be the same throughout all the products. And I was thinking now, whenever there was like a breaking change, we would generate like a breaking semver. And then it's like, hey, everybody, if you're going to update the library, be careful because the date picker is going to break. So here is the change log. And a lot of times, like you need to change one thing and you would break the other. I didn't want to touch the date picker in this.
Yeah. And then you gotta move so slow.
Yeah. So this was like starting to happen. I'm thinking now about why not version components? Why should I throw out the previous one if I create a breaking change? Why not create like import?
I've got an interesting example there. I used to work in the old Sun Microsystem buildings for Sun Microsystems remotely. And then I worked in those same buildings for Facebook after Sun Microsystems was no longer a thing. And they had very different philosophies on how to do their components. Sun Microsystems had versioned components. They would release a new version of their UI library, and then everybody would have to manually update to the latest version, for each product team. And the Facebook way was like, if you owned this component and you were going to change the API, it was up to you to make that change in the entire code base. So they started to do they invested a lot into code mod technology. So you could just, it was all one mono repo. So you could, as part of your change to the library or the component itself, change its usage everywhere in one fell swoop. That doesn't really work in the open source world because there's not one mono repo with every single project and product
the world
in the universe.
Yeah.
But think of how useful that would be if you could just code mod the universe with, well, maybe not.
Great power.
Spider-Man, save us!
Yeah. We could make an episode regarding like monorepo pros and cons too. Maybe
not on this podcast.
Yeah. Yeah, this is interesting. So yeah, going back to the backend part. So agreed that this middleware layer helps us a lot. Who should work on this middleware layer? Should the front end people work in this middleware layer? Should the backend people work in this middleware layer? Should both?
It boils down to who needs it to exist and who has to maintain it forever.
And what would be, the exact definition of this middleware layer again?
Let's say, for the sake of argument, we have a GraphQL server that will give us all the data to our front-end application. This GraphQL server, be it like a normal server that is reaching for REST APIs or a serverless implementation, should this be maintained by front end, by people who are actually writing the UI in an ideal world? Imagine that you have an ideal world. You can choose. You have like as many devs with as many skill sets that you want. Like, who should own that?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the backend team. I don't know, but it depends kind of, exactly how that's being built. If it's built using traditional GraphQL technologies, i.e., you're not using an abstraction like AppSync or Prisma or something, where you're actually writing the database queries and you're writing the resolvers and you're kind of writing all of the authorization logic and stuff like that. That definitely seems like a backend job to me. If you're using something like AppSync or you're using an abstraction that allows you to kind of like build the backend from your front end, if that makes any sense, if you've ever used one of these tools before, that might fall into the front end developers. So I guess it kind of depends on what tools you're using.
Yeah.
One major question is like, how is it coupled to your front end or decoupled? Can you make a change to the front end without changing the middleware layer, or vice versa? Because if you have to, then it has to be owned by the same team.
But Thomas, more or less, like maybe there's another question there, which is like how many front ends are using that server too?
Right, that's a good question.
Because like you have the data source, and the data source is the data source for like the web version and the app version. So even though a lot of times you need to change things together, you also like need to talk to the other team to make sure that
if you have something that's tightly coupled to multiple products owned by separate teams, you're gonna have a nightmare. Like
maybe it was a bad idea in the first place. Wow. Yeah, if it's tightly coupled.
Oh, yeah. I'm getting shivers just thinking about it.
And then like you have like multiple ownership, like multiple teams owning, like maintaining. What about the dirty work for that middleware, right? Who does it? And
contractors.
Yeah, that's
why they get paid the big bucks.
Interns who are going to leave the day later.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this conversation because a lot of the work that we're doing on my team at AWS is kind of like centered around building abstractions that allow front-end developers to do all of this stuff that we're talking about on the back end. So, for instance, we have a library called the GraphQL Transform library that's built into our CLI that allows you to use these directives in your GraphQL schema to do things like add authorization, to add field level fine-grained access control, to add things like declaratively building out your resolvers based on your definitions of what different operations that you have created, and then giving you kind of like a very high-level overview of what you're doing by using these directives. But we kind of take those directives and build out, a lot more on the back end for you, just kind of taking, smart assumptions based on like what people are doing. And then from there, you can kind of like go and polish and edit things if you need to make changes. But the broad assumptions are kind of like taken by us. And it seems to be pretty popular because, we've had quite a bit of growth. And it kind of is opening the door for front-end developers to build these complex, scalable backends without having to understand, a lot of the complexity around, building out backends in general.
And one thing that I have seen from a move towards things like that is there seems to be irrational resistance to it that may be coming from a place of just kind of like the irrational resistance to React Native, of like people who have all these iOS skills or Android skills, maybe they're threatened or feeling threatened, maybe even subconsciously without realizing it. So all these like server-side people or, who've had this whole career being experts on the server side, suddenly you have this magical technology that makes their entire career irrelevant. That's going to be terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, so I hear that, but I don't like agree that it like makes their skill set irrelevant. From what we're actually seeing is there's so many problems that need to be solved in a typical team. Yeah. There's so much work to be done. These tools to me are like taking away the type of work that is very, very like things that you do over and over and over. So for instance, building out an authentication service, building out a CRUD API, building out, some of these things that you kind of do over and over and over for every application, just kind of like automating that basic stuff. So these specialized engineers can actually do more of the important work, which would be anything that doesn't fall into those categories.
I understand both points of view. Like I understand what you're saying, Eddie, because like this is like the rational, like actually what's happening, and what should like your mindset be. But I also understand like the emotional response of some people feeling like threatened. But yeah, this is like technology innovation. Like my father, he was a sound engineer. He was in the market when digital started happening, right? When people transitioned from like recording everything tapes to using like the computer to record. And his studio, he built a studio. It was like the first studio in Brazil that was like 100% digital. So his studio was like, I don't know, maybe it took like $1 million to build everything. It was like super expensive for in today. But previous studios were like at least $20 million cost. Wow. So this is the crazy part. Like people who had a $20 million in equipment, they were saying like, no, I won't. It's like, this is really bad. This is they were like having these reactions. But on the same time, the next wave of technology made studios that were like $20,000 as good as the 1 million ones. So like the innovation. So of course, the studio that my father was working in like went out of, was like taken away by the technology rupture. Like of course I got sad because like I love that studio. It was like my teen years I was inside the studio. But if you think about that now, today, like a lot more people are recording music, a lot more people, like this is much more accessible. And then you're not thinking about like how to record your music anymore. You think about like which music I'm going to record, which is probably like a much better thing. Like it's better for music in general that people are thinking about that and not about, oh my God, I don't have a microphone. I don't have access to a place where I can sing and my voice will be recorded.
It seems to be like it just changes things. Yeah. Yes, certain things are not the same, but doesn't mean the opportunities aren't still there. And the way that I kind of look at this is what happened when things like Wix and all of these tools came out over the last 10 years that allowed people to build their landing pages and their websites easier. Yeah. I mean, so many people used to come to me when I was studying software engineering and learning how to code, and they were like, why are you learning how to code? Like, you could just build a website. Like, people aren't going to need your skill set anymore. And 5 years later, we're more in demand than ever. Yeah, when we automate these tasks that are just done over and over and over, we actually free ourselves up to do
and create more. Yeah, we create more. Like, think about the search experience. Search experience in the beginning of like the Yahoo days were just browsing, listing stuff alphabetically. The fact that work was like more and more and more automated. We have like today, like probably 10 times more people work on search experience, 100 times more people work on search experience around the world with like much more specialized needs, much more interesting.
The big deal for this is that the whole issue of updates, of staying updated. Like, half the population at least is really, really wants things to be settled and to stay the same for a long time so that you can build expertise in a skill. But the things are moving so fast, and the acceleration of change in our industry is moving so quickly that it's almost impossible to really build up expertise in anything, because by the time you've reached novice level, everything's changed.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, like, can anyone say that they're an expert on anything right now unless they're one of the top 5%? I mean, we can say that, but in reality, we're just learning as we go. At least I am. There's things that we know, that we build up knowledge, this base knowledge of how to write code and how to, structure our applications and logic and those types of things. But the APIs change so fast and things happen so quickly that rarely have I built an application without spending at least half of my time on Google.
Yeah. So part of it, like, a pro tip for any people like me listening to this who, I used to get really excited about all the new stuff, and I would go and share it with everybody, like, oh, look at this new thing that's coming out that's going to make your job irrelevant. And then they would irrationally react with fear and hatred instead of excitement. And I was surprised.
Yeah.
Now I know to express things in a slightly different way that's less infuriating.
Yeah.
So to kind of wrap things up, what is the conclusion of this conversation? To me, it's kind of like understanding that there's different ways to do this type of stuff. But to me, if you're listening and you want to kind of like really get on some next level stuff, look at some of the abstractions that are being built out in the serverless world. It doesn't have to be AWS stuff like I'm working on, but there's a lot of other things out there like Hasura. There's Next.js with Zeit, and they have the now version 2.0 that does serverless functions pretty in an interesting way. There's Hasura, I think I mentioned them, Prisma. There's a lot of interesting stuff out there in this space that kind of like brings the back end down to the front end and allows you to kind of extend your front end skill set to build these full stack apps.
Yeah.
So I guess we'll go ahead and jump to the picks.
Let's do it.
Before we do that, is there anything anyone else wanted to touch on?
My closing notes for this issue is that it's complicated, and don't forget that we're humans and that all humans are irrational. Embrace it.
Yeah. Love it.
This episode is brought to you by TripleByte. Applying to programming jobs sucks. You have to put the right keywords in your resume, you spend hours and hours on the phone screens and take-home projects, and that's assuming the company even responds to your application. Well, if you're a software engineer, TripleByte can help. They work with over 400 top tech companies, from big names like Dropbox and Adobe to exciting startups. You do one brief online interview with them, and if you do well, you go straight to final interviews with the company on their platform. It's like the Common App for software developers. TripleByte does not look at your resume or where you went to school. All they care about is if you can code. I've helped dozens of software developers with various credentials get jobs, and this looks like a terrific way for you to get in and get interviewed and get a job without a lot of the hassle and overhead. You can go check them out at triplebyte.com/react. That's triplebyte.com, byte as in 8 bits. As a special offer for listeners of this show, if you take a job through TripleByte, they'll offer you a $1,000 signing bonus.
Do you have any picks?
Oh, yeah, sure. I have one pick, which is my wife just launched groovytiesquad.com, where she's making custom and groovy ties if you have to wear a tie or want to. And my other pick is a book that I'm in the middle of reading, The Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene. Like, explaining humans to humans as if they were aliens.
I'm actually reading that book right now.
Awesome.
It's so funny.
It's so good.
It's awesome. It's really long, but it's really good.
It's so long.
Awesome. Yeah, +1 on that book. Lucas, do you have any picks?
Yes, I have. I came across this blog by Eric Bernardson. I don't know if I'm going to be able to pronounce his name correctly, but it's such a great blog. And I really like this post called Why Software Projects Take Longer Than You Think, a Statistical Model, where he's trying to explain I love statistics too. So he's trying to explain like how the nature of project duration makes it that we're really bad at estimating. Yes, it's a really interesting blog. He talks about the big takeaway is like no project can take less than 0 days, right? So like a project that goes really well, like if you think it's going to take a week, if it goes really well, it takes like 2 days. So you got like 3 days out of that. A project that you think is going to take 4 weeks, if it goes really 1 week, if it goes really bad, it may take like, 5-6 weeks. So the projects the estimations that go well, the project go well, better than the estimation, they are overwhelmed by the estimations that the project goes wrong. They are overwhelmed. And this is like a natural probability and statistical conclusion of how durations work. So it's really interesting. It's a little bit like sad, but it's like it's a really interesting read. So I recommend this post. And the whole blog is really good. He also has a post on interviewing, which is really good. Yeah. This is my pick.
Cool. David, do you have any picks?
I've only got one this week, but I found this static site generator called Eleventy, which I hadn't heard of before. It's pretty much like Jekyll, but JavaScript. So a little less, I think it's still kind of customizable, but it comes sort of with a lot of defaults out of the box. And it seems like sort of like Gatsby, but if you really just want a blog and something with a bunch of pre-configured stuff for you, it looks like a pretty good option. So starting to play around with that.
Cool. I keep hearing about it. I've never tried it. I'll have to give it a shot.
I love the name, 11d.io.
Yeah, it's great. 11ty.io.
So my pick is a book as well. First of all, the book that Thomas chose is really good. And then my pick is a book called The Never Hero. And I'm listening to it right now as an audiobook with my son. It's kind of like a science fiction book that is, more like along the level of like maybe a teenage science fiction book, but it's actually really good. And another pick, I guess, would be listening to books in the car with your kids. Pretty cool stuff to do. And it's, just a good way to pass the time and bond, I guess. So
nice.
Gives you stuff to talk about.
Yeah, it does. I've enjoyed it a lot over the years. And Audible is what I use for my books. I know there's some other options out there as well.
Anything that helps you have like inside jokes with your squad.
Yeah, I mean, we listened to Ready Player One way before the movie came out. So when the movie came out, we were just like all hyped to go watch it together, because we had this thing, and a lot of people, around here hadn't read the book. So,
any good?
Yeah, it's really good. The book it's probably one of my favorite books now. The movie was good too, but the book was just amazing. All right. Well, I think that will wrap up this episode of React Roundup. Thank you, everyone, for being on the panel and for hanging out.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
So
it's been fun.
That wraps up this episode. We'll see everyone next time.
Good night, everybody.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.